Hello everybody, I am Jmulls of Jmulls Gaming, and there's one massive element to Xenoblade Chronicles X Definitive Edition that I want to address and cover in today's video. The fact that it is a Definitive Edition. You see, they've done Definitive Editions before. You are probably familiar with Xenoblade Chronicles 1 Definitive Edition, and there was a unique addition to that version of Xenoblade Chronicles 1. It was an epilogue entitled Future Connected. So naturally, when Xenoblade Chronicles X Definitive Edition was announced, some people were wondering, well, will this game receive the same level of treatment? Will it have some kind of post-game epilogue to follow on the events? Because especially for Xenoblade Chronicles X, the game ended on a massive cliffhanger. There's plenty of room to cover. So let's get into it. I want to share my thoughts on the viability, or the possibility at least, for a Future Connected-esque story for Xenoblade Chronicles X. And the short answer here for me is that I'm pessimistic about its possible existence. For an extremely simple reason. I feel that if it was going to exist, you would have announced it in that initial announcement trailer. They've announced new story elements, so their play might be to add additional story that could be the same size as Future Connected, but interspaced throughout the story of Xenoblade X in various different locations. That could be the route they go. But I just feel that if you were going to make a Future Connected for Xenoblade X, you would have announced it with that initial announcement trailer. I just don't see the advantage or the benefit for Nintendo or Monolith in delaying that announcement. There is one exception to this, and it could be that you desperately want to avoid spoilers. When it came to Future Connected, announcing that Shulk and Melia were going to go on a new adventure in the new world was a spoiler, but like, in terms of degree, you still couldn't particularly put the pieces of the puzzle together in regards to what happened throughout Xenoblade 1. With Xenoblade X, there's giant fundamental aspects to the world and the way of thinking for the people that encompass that world that you kinda can't gloss over. Like, one of the characters changes their appearance drastically, and the likely story that it will cover will almost certainly amount to massive spoilers. So, if it does exist, I could see the reason for masquerading its existence being you want to avoid these overarching spoilers that are supposed to be massive plot twists in the base game, and perhaps the internal calculus that they're operating with is that, hey, do we really need to advertise that there's going to be an additional expanded story at the end of Xenoblade X? Would that really move the needle for anyone in terms of sales? Possibly for a few people, but maybe it's not all that significant. So maybe we hold our cards close to the chest, and the prospect of being able to play Xenoblade X on modern hardware that's not the Wii freaking U is enough of an incentive for a lot of people to drum up excitement and word of mouth for this game. I'm still pessimistic about that way of thinking personally, but if it does pan out to be the case, I can at least see some logic for that. I still think the winning argument for me is that there likely won't be a Future Connected story, it'll just be additional story elements which they've already announced throughout the story itself, and maybe it's just more significant than we were expecting or are expecting. Because the other counter argument for me would be, the plot reveals at the end of Xenoblade X point to another game, where you would need an entire other game to properly address all these different situations and story elements, and a far shorter, streamlined experience probably wouldn't be the best medium to wrap up all these plot threads, depending upon if you really want to follow up the story of Xenoblade X. Whether you want to bring that into canon, which we've talked about before, or if you want to keep X as its separate entity, I feel as Xenoblade Chronicles X2 would be a better vehicle to convey these story elements than just simply a shortened, like, DLC-esque story experience. It's not like in Xenoblade 1, where that game wrapped up beautifully, and you didn't really need a follow-up to that game, but it was also a very focused epilogue that largely focused around Melia and concluding her story, at least until Xenoblade 3 came around. So because of the scope of the matter for Xenoblade 1 Definitive Edition, Future Connected was far smaller, largely focusing just on a couple of characters, namely Melia, I know some people aren't that big big of a fan of Future Connected, but personally, I liked its scope and scale, and I thought it was appropriate to address that story with Melia. But that's not the case with Xenoblade X. It's like, the issues and story paradigms on display in Xenoblade X concern all of Mira, all of humanity that is on Mira, all of New LA, all of the people and the aliens that are on Mira. The scope is just simply larger. And to properly illustrate those examples, we have to now transition into spoilers, so from here on out, I'm going to be spoiling the story of Xenoblade Chronicles X. In 3, 2, 1. Okay, now for the spoiler talk. Like, Lao himself is a massive, question mark. The guy who betrayed all of humanity is now alive, and we have this mysterious black-hooded stranger that we just know nothing about. No, I do not buy that he is Malos. I think that's just... I've seen that theory go around. I think it's simply just English dubbing that sounds similar to him. I don't buy that's Malos at all. But you not only have Lao being alive, which is this whole can of worms, you have this entire new entity with the black-hooded stranger, the Black Knight, but also you have the plot reveal that the Lifehold was offline since the beginning of the game, and there's no real reason humanity is even alive right now. So there's something else out there, or there's just something about Mira that's keeping humanity alive in the Mimiosomes. Like, the ending of Xenoblade X pretty much put the entire story on its head, and said the stakes that we thought were there throughout the entire game, that sword of Damocles, with the Lifehold's battery running out, yeah, it just didn't exist. It was an illusion. Everything we thought we knew about Mira turned out to be wrong. And sure, if you don't want to make it that big of a deal, maybe you can make it a story that could be finalized in a Future Connected size story arc. I just don't see why you would do that, because the impression I got when I saw all these scenes after beating Xenoblade X was, oh, they were planning a follow-up game. And I've talked about before, I thought if we were ever going to see Xenoblade Chronicles X2, we would first have to see Definitive Edition for Xenoblade X, simply because most of modern Xenoblade players just haven't played X because it was on the Wii U. So you would want them to be refreshed about the story, and to be invested in the world and its characters. So if you are going to go the route of, say, Xenoblade Chronicles X2, a Xenoblade Chronicles X Definitive Edition, where it's now available, Xenoblade is now a larger IP than ever before, there's a lot of hungry people out there wanting that succulent meal that is Xenoblade X, it just made a lot of sense to me. And honestly, at this point, the only question mark I have is, what is the direction of the story going forward? It's like one of three pathways that we found ourselves at the crossroads. Either this is all we get for Xenoblade Chronicles X, and they never decide to follow it up. I would find that to be a bit disappointing, because I love Xenoblade X so much. They could also say, hey, we are going to go the route of Xenoblade Chronicles X2, but we need you to understand the actual story first, and be invested in all these story elements in Mira, in Elma, in what Elma's reveal at the end of X represents, in Lao, in the Black Knight. So we need, if we want to do Xenoblade X2, we're going to do X Definitive Edition first, now that Xenoblade has broader appeal, or you can go the third route and say, we are trying to bring Xenoblade X into the canon of Xenoblade 1, 2, and 3, which we've talked about before. Not every story element fits, but we've left the story of Xenoblade X malleable enough to where we can write reveals to put it into canon. So perhaps these overarching questions we have at the end of Xenoblade X could be followed up and addressed properly in Xenoblade 4 or something like that. There's a lot of interesting ways they can go about addressing these questions if they want to address them at all. Because for all we know, Xenoblade X Definitive Edition could be that first route where they're like, okay, this is all we're going to do with X. We're going to write these new story moments into Definitive Edition just to give some closure, but we don't want to address this going forward. I don't really see the real reason to do that. I know it's been a long time since X came out, but now we're getting X Definitive Edition. The hype for X is hotter and more potent and valuable than ever before. I just don't see the reason to shutting off this entire world simply to focus on the main timeline. I think the most likely answer is you go the route of either, at some point in the future, an X2, or bringing the story of X into canon and making it fit. They are the writers that can do it if they really want to, as we've talked about. I think one of those two routes is way more likely than just saying, yeah, that was X, have fun with it, we'll never talk about it again. I just don't see that being a likely possibility. I mean, it is a possibility at the end of the day, I just don't see it being that likely. There is one other scenario that I could see happening if they want to do a future connected story, and essentially have it be this separate story element that takes place at the end of Xenoblade X, that I think this could be a very interesting way to go about doing this, that kind of serves as a bridge between X and a possible X2, or follow-up in the future, where you don't need to address all the questions that were raised at the end of Xenoblade X, but you could like pick and choose, maybe pick one or two of them and really hone it in on them. Like maybe we really address the Black Knight, or we address the Lifehold situation, and we really dive into that one story element and use it as like a gateway between Xenoblade X and whatever they have decided over the last like 10 or so years since then for the future of the story. Kind of like bridging the gap. Similar to how Future Connected, while it largely did address that lingering question about like Melia and where his story was going to go at the end of Xenoblade 1, but it also introduced the fog, which was brought back up again in Xenoblade 3, especially with Future Redeemed. You can do something like that. I think that could be very interesting, and would get my theory crafting brain just going into maximum overdrive. I don't know how likely that would be, but if we're talking about what like routes I would most want to see, I think that could be very interesting, because honestly, I'm kind of 50-50 on what I would prefer, whether or not they bring the story into canon, or just continue it as its own separate entity. I'm kind of fine with both. It's an interesting thing to think about, in my opinion, especially for a story that, for all intents and purposes, felt forgotten for so long. It wasn't that popular of a game because of the console that it was on, and Xenoblade Until 2 wasn't really particularly that popular. And like now, almost out of thin air, because they just shadow dropped this on a random Tuesday, because why not? All of a sudden, all those lingering hopes that Xenoblade X fans, myself included, had for so long about seeing something Xenoblade X related in the future that were once discarded as nothing more than like hope and like pointless optimism that came from nowhere, now have legs to stand on. They could just be doing Xenoblade X Definitive Edition because it was the one Xenoblade entry that wasn't on modern hardware. Like, that could be easily the reason they're doing this, or it could be something more. And look, a lot of Xenoblade X fans at the end of the day are used to hoping, because we've had our hope for the better part of a decade at this point, for there to be anything in regards to Xenoblade X. Like, we got Elma back in Xenoblade 2. Like, that was the most we got. Maybe it's just foolish optimism at the end of the day, but maybe I want to be foolishly optimistic about this. And it could also be that Xenoblade X Definitive Edition's a test. Like, maybe they are putting themselves in a position as Monolith and Nintendo where they're going, okay, let's see how this does. Are people receptive to Mira? Are they receptive to Elma? Are they receptive to Xenoblade X as a story, as a location, as a world, as a game? With Definitive Edition, let's give it the tender love and care that it needs. Let's make Definitive Edition, and then based upon reception, we use Xenoblade X as a test. If it does well enough, then we can go, okay, let's double down, let's do something with this. Or, if it doesn't do well enough, they can go, okay, well, we did that, let's go back to main timeline, let's go focus on whatever else. And it could just be that Xenoblade X Definitive Edition is them trying to capitalize off of Xenoblade X as we are approaching a new console generation for Nintendo, but also acting as a test, like a litmus test, to see and gauge potential interest in the expansion of Xenoblade X. So I guess at the end of the day, that could be a fourth route that I wasn't considering before. Look, personally, if we're talking about whether or not I would want to see a Definitive Edition, Future Connected version for Xenoblade X, I would, because it would mean more Xenoblade X. And I want to see where this story goes. I've been waiting for so long to figure out what happens with Lao, what happens with the Black Knight, what happens with Elma and humanity, with the Lifehold. These are questions I am very interested to see followed up, but the thing is, if there isn't a Future Connected, or there isn't an epilogue in some shape or form, I just don't see them being followed up in the base game, even with additional story elements, because a lot of these plot reveals happened at the very end. Like, they didn't happen in Chapter 11, they happened at the end of Chapter 12. Like, in the final cutscenes of the game. Maybe they add an additional quest, but you would need, like, more than that if you want to address everything, unless you want to make a Xenoblade X2 at some point in the future and you just want to gauge interest right now. It'll be interesting to see. I'm fascinated by what they could do with this, because, like, don't get me wrong, if it is just a a few additional story elements sprinkled throughout Xenoblade X and we don't get a future connected story, I'm not going to be upset. Like, that's just not gonna happen for me. If we do manage to get something new and cool and exciting, thumbs up for me, I'll be there. Absolutely. If they want to continue the story of Xenoblade X in the future, I would love to see that. That's what I want more at the end of the day. And with that, I think I'll call the video there for the day. Thank you all for tuning in. My pleasure for making the video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like and subscribe. It really helps the channel out and helps support future content, and I greatly appreciate it. Stay safe, have a great day. I'll see you all next time. Bye-bye, everybody. Until we meet again.